For centuries, the influence of Black Africans in European history has been ignored or erased, despite clear evidence. We've been taught a version of history that suggests Europe was built by Europeans alone, but the proof of Black influence is everywhere. Greek vases with African warriors, medieval churches with Black saints, and noble families incorporating African figures into their emblems. To no surprise, many people have no idea about this legacy. History has been rewritten to make it seem as though Africa and Europe had little to do with each other. The truth has been buried under layers of Eurocentric narratives that cast Africa as a passive land waiting to be discovered, rather than an active force shaping global civilizations. But the evidence has always been there, hiding in plain sight. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So join us today as we explore the Black African presence in European history and the striking facts and images from ancient Europe that historians and institutions tried to hide for so long. Give this video a like to show your support. And let's begin. Moving back to antiquity, Greek art and literature from as early as the 6th century BCE provide some of the earliest European depictions of Africans. Unlike the stereotypical portrayals that emerged in later centuries, these early representations often carried respect and admiration. The Greeks, who had extensive contact with Egypt and other African civilizations, incorporated African figures into their pottery, sculptures, and writings. One such example is the Janiform oil vessel, created between 525 and 475 BCE, which presents an African man and a Greek woman in a two-faced design. This artifact alone already shows how much Africans were acknowledged by the Greeks at the time, as it reflects an artistic fascination with ethnic diversity and cross-cultural interactions. Similarly, the pitcher in the form of the head of an African, dating to around 510 BCE, was crafted in the shape of an African man's head, showing how the Greeks admired Africans in their art. Another notable example is the Attic white ground alabastron, dating from approximately 480 BCE, which depicts an African figure dressed in distinct attire that shows the everyday presence of Africans in Greek life. And beyond everyday objects, Greek artists captured Africans in mythological and historical narratives. The black figure Hydria, depicting Heracles and Busiris from around 510 BCE, portrays the myth of Heracles battling the Egyptian king Busiris. Another significant artifact is the Arcesilas cup, painted between 565 to 560 BCE by the Laconian artist known as the Arcesilas painter. This kylix, or drinking cup, features King Arcesilaus II of Cyrene, overseeing the weighing and packing of goods, including African traders involved in commerce. It reinforces the economic and trade connections between Greece and Africa, a reality often overlooked in mainstream narratives. These artifacts show that Africans lived, worked, and contributed to ancient Greek society in many meaningful ways. They appear in art as traders, warriors, and cultural figures, depicted with striking realism that reflects their presence in daily life. Ancient writers also confirmed what these images show. The historian Herodotus, known as the father of history, didn't describe Ethiopians as mere foreigners. He called them the most handsome of men, and wrote about their advanced customs and formidable strength. He recorded that the Persian king Cambyses II attempted to invade their lands and failed. The Greeks knew Africa was a land of power and influence. They learned from it, they respected it, and they borrowed from its knowledge. Then came Rome, and with it, a continuation of Africa's presence in European history. If the Greeks acknowledged Africa's role in their world, the Romans made it impossible to ignore. African traders moved through the empire, their goods fueling the Roman economy, and African soldiers not only fought and died for Rome, but also rose through the ranks to lead legions. The Roman military was one of the most disciplined forces in history, and among its elite commanders stood Lucius Quietus, a Moorish general who fought for Emperor Trajan. His victories in battle were so impressive that he was considered as a possible successor to the emperor himself. Let that sink in. An African general, on the brink of ruling the greatest empire of its time. But how often is his name mentioned in classrooms? How many people even know he existed? Quietus's rise was so remarkable that it became a threat. He was chosen by Emperor Trajan as his successor. but Rome's elite refused to accept it. When Trajan died, a Roman senator named Hadrian ignored his wishes, seized power, and ordered Quietus's assassination to eliminate any challenge to his rule. But Quietus wasn't the only one silenced. The Legio IX Hispana, one of Rome's most powerful legions, reportedly sided with him against Hadrian. For that, they too vanished from history. After the tragic tale of Quietus, there was Septimius Severus, a black emperor born in Leptis Magna, in what is now Libya. Unlike Quietus, Severus successfully seized power after the empire fell into chaos, following the assassination of Emperor Commodus in 192 CE. He defeated his rivals in a brutal civil war and emerged as the sole ruler of Rome. From 193 to 211 CE, he strengthened Rome's borders, reshaped its military, and cemented his authority. Yet mainstream history barely acknowledges that an African sat on the throne of Rome. His son Caracalla followed in his footsteps, leaving behind monuments that still stand today. More African emperors followed. Marcus Opellius Macrinus, a Roman of North African descent, became emperor in 217 CE after orchestrating Caracalla's assassination. And Aemilianus, born in modern-day Tunisia, took the throne in 253 CE after leading a successful military campaign. All of these Africans ruled as emperors of Rome, not as mere footnotes in history. Their reigns destroy the notion that Rome was a purely European empire. Despite all this, the African presence in ancient Europe has been systematically erased. The colonial era reshaped the way history was told, stripping Africa of its contributions to civilization. Their goal was evident: justify slavery, justify conquest, justify oppression. To do that, they had to pretend Africa was a place of darkness, untouched by progress, until Europeans arrived to civilize it. But the truth never disappeared. The artwork, the writings, the ruins, they still stand as undeniable proof of Africa's deep connection to European history. By the time we reach the Middle Ages, the African presence in Europe becomes even harder to deny. And yet, history has done its best to erase or distort the story of the Moors. For nearly 800 years, the Moors ruled over vast territories in what is now Spain and Portugal, leaving behind a civilization that transformed Europe. Unfortunately, the idea of black and North African rulers in Europe was erased because those who invented racist hierarchies couldn't stand the truth. So instead of acknowledging the Moors as the architects of Spain's golden age, history has branded them as invaders and erased the reality of what they built. The very word Moor tells us a lot about how their identity has been manipulated. The term comes from the Latin Maurus, which means dark or black. When the Moors arrived in Spain in 711 AD, they were a diverse people, including Berbers from North Africa, Arabs from the Middle East, and sub-Saharan Africans. Historical accounts confirm that many of the Moors had dark skin, and their depictions in medieval European art reflect this. Yet, over time, efforts to Europeanize history have led many to downplay their African origins, describing them only as Muslim invaders, rather than acknowledging their complex ethnic makeup. But contrary to how they've been depicted, the Moors did not simply conquer Spain. They built a civilization that was centuries ahead of its time. British historian Basil Davidson, a preeminent scholar of African history, declared that throughout Europe in the 8th century AD, no lands were more admired by their neighbors or more comfortable to live in than the rich African civilization that took shape in Spain. At a point when much of Christian Europe was trapped in feudalism and widespread illiteracy, the Moors established cities that became centers of knowledge, science, and innovation. Córdoba, the capital of Moorish Spain, was the largest and most advanced city in Europe, with paved streets, streetlights, hospitals, and public baths. The Moors created public libraries filled with thousands of books, while in the rest of Europe, even kings and nobles often lacked access to written knowledge. They were able to preserve ancient Greek and Roman texts, while also making breakthroughs in medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, which later contributed to the European Renaissance. And their contributions to medicine were groundbreaking. One of the most influential Moorish scholars was al-Zahrawi. a physician whose work on surgery remained the leading medical textbook in Europe for centuries. He introduced over 200 surgical instruments, many of which are still in use today. His writings on childbirth, dental procedures, and the treatment of fractures set a standard that European doctors would follow long after the Moors were gone. Mathematics was another field where the Moors left an undeniable mark. The cumbersome Roman numeral system was replaced by the Arabic numeral system, introduced to Spain by the Moors. This shift made calculations easier and paved the way for the scientific advancements of the Renaissance. Algebra, a term derived from the Arabic al-jabr, was refined and developed under Moorish scholars. They also introduced the concept of zero, which revolutionized mathematics and commerce. The Moors reshaped European agriculture as well. Their irrigation techniques, brought from North Africa and the Middle East, transformed the dry landscapes of Spain into fertile farmland. They introduced new crops such as oranges, lemons, peaches, apricots, figs, sugarcane, and rice, many of which are still essential to Spanish cuisine today. They built vast irrigation networks, including underground water channels and aqueducts that allowed cities to thrive in ways previously impossible. Despite these achievements, the Moors faced increasing hostility as Christian kingdoms sought to reclaim Spain. The Reconquista, a centuries-long campaign to drive out Muslim rulers, was framed as a holy war. By 1492, when the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella captured Granada, the last Moorish stronghold, what followed was a systematic effort to erase the Moorish legacy. Libraries were burned, scholars were expelled or forced to convert, and architecture was repurposed to fit Christian rule. Moorish buildings, with their intricate designs and geometric patterns, were either destroyed or Christianized, with crosses replacing Islamic calligraphy and minarets converted into bell towers. This erasure was driven by more than the goal of reclaiming land. It was a deliberate effort to control history. The idea of a brilliant, advanced African-led civilization in medieval Europe didn't fit with the emerging ideas of racial superiority that they would later use to justify colonization and slavery. So the Moors, once celebrated for their knowledge and leadership, were reduced in European history to little more than a foreign enemy. Their influence, however, never truly disappeared. The architecture of Spain, the agricultural techniques still in use, the scientific texts that shaped European thought, all of it remains proof of the civilization built under their rule. No matter how much information has been suppressed, no one can really hide the fact that the Moors were brilliant rulers, scholars, engineers, and architects who left a legacy that Europe still benefits from today. And that is exactly why white history tried to forget them. But try as they may, the black presence in Europe can't be completely erased. For centuries, African figures appeared in the coats of arms of European noble families, yet most people today have no idea why. Heraldry, the practice of designing and displaying coats of arms, was a way for noble families to showcase their ancestry, victories, and alliances. Within this tradition, African figures were not just common, but highly honored. One striking example is the coat of arms of Aragon, which prominently features multiple black Moorish heads. This emblem is tied to the Reconquista, specifically the Battle of Alcaraz in 1096, where King Peter I of Aragon reportedly defeated Muslim forces. The four Moors in the coat of arms are said to represent the fallen Muslim leaders from that battle. The Kingdom of Aragon was a dominant force in medieval Spanish history. So this raises an undeniable question. If Africans had no place in European nobility, why did one of the most powerful kingdoms in Spain display them so prominently on its crest? Spain had been under Moorish rule for centuries, and even after their expulsion, noble families continued to honor this connection. But the black presence in European heraldry was not limited to Spain. In Germany, the Archbishopric of Freising has featured a crowned Moor's head on its coat of arms since at least 1284. While the exact origin of this symbol is debated, this emblem became widely recognized and was even incorporated into the personal coat of arms of Pope Benedict XVI during his tenure as Archbishop of Munich and Freising. Official records suggest that the symbol originally portrayed a noble African ally or leader who had a significant influence on the region's history. Further south, the Kingdom of Sardinia maintained a strong connection to its Moorish past through its own four Moors emblem. This symbol is believed to have originated in the 14th century under the rule of the Crown of Aragon, which controlled Sardinia at the time. Its design, which appears on the flag of Sardinia, originally depicted four blindfolded black heads, a representation tied to victories over Muslim forces. Over time, modifications were made, and in 1999, the regional government adjusted it to remove the blindfolds and reposition them as headbands. Similarly, the island of Corsica has long used the Moor's head emblem, known as the Bandera Testa Mora, a symbol that has remained central to its identity despite variations in depiction over the centuries. But as racial attitudes in Europe changed over time, the original meaning of many of these symbols was deliberately erased. Symbols that once recognized African influence in European power were gradually reinterpreted as mere decoration. Others were given misleading explanations, with some being reframed as representations of the defeat of the Moors, rather than acknowledging any genuine historical connection. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as racial ideologies became more entrenched in European thought, the reinterpretation of these symbols grew increasingly deliberate. Many heraldic emblems were modified or reimagined to align with shifting social narratives. Some coats of arms that once featured noble black figures were altered in later depictions, with their skin tones lightened to downplay their African heritage. The heraldry of Aragon, for instance, historically featured four black Moorish heads. However, over time, their depiction was sometimes modified to reduce or obscure any noble or dignified representation of African figures. The coat of arms of Coburg, a German city, originally displayed a clearly African figure. However, in 1934, the government forbade any glorification of the African race, and they replaced the coat of arms with one depicting a vertical sword with a swastika on the pommel. Fortunately, the original coat of arms was restored in 1945 at the end of World War II. But similar distortions occurred elsewhere. The heraldic depictions of Saint Maurice, a revered Roman soldier of African descent who became the patron saint of the Holy Roman Empire, were gradually modified. Earlier images from medieval times clearly portrayed him with African features, but many later representations softened or erased those characteristics entirely, making him appear more European. Over and over, the black presence in history was downplayed, while white figures took credit for achievements in power and innovation. That's why we must keep in mind that history is not just about what is remembered. It's also about what has been erased. The systematic removal of African contributions to European civilization wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate act, carried out over centuries to serve a political agenda. The reality of Africans in ancient Greece and Rome, the rule of the Moors in Spain, and the noble African figures immortalized in European heraldry all challenged the racial hierarchies that colonial powers wanted to impose. If Africa had once been home to powerful civilizations that influenced Europe, then the justification for colonization and the transatlantic slave trade fell apart. So in order to maintain control, Europe rewrote the history that connected Africa to the very foundations of human progress. Textbooks were rewritten to exclude African contributions, making sure that generations of students in both Europe and Africa were taught a Eurocentric version of history. Museums displayed artifacts from Africa without context, stripping them of their historical significance. Art was misinterpreted, with black figures in medieval European paintings explained away as symbolic rather than reflective of real African individuals who lived, traded, and held power in Europe. Even language was manipulated. Terms like Moors and Ethiopians, once understood to include black Africans, were gradually redefined to distance them from their original racial and cultural meanings. The consequences of this erasure are still felt today. Most people, even those who study history, are unaware of the deep connections between Africa and Europe in the ancient and medieval worlds. The false notion that Africa was always separate from European progress remains deeply ingrained. It's a carefully constructed lie, one designed to maintain racial hierarchies and justify the exploitation of African people and resources. But despite the efforts to erase these truths, history has a way of preserving itself. The evidence never truly disappeared. It exists in the artwork, in the architecture, in the family crests of noble European houses. It's there in the writings of ancient historians and in the ruins of Moorish palaces in Spain. No matter how much history was distorted, the truth was never fully erased. It only waits to be rediscovered. Now, as more scholars, researchers, and everyday people begin to challenge these long-standing historical distortions, the story of Africa's role in European civilization is coming back into the light. The truth is undeniable. The only question is, are people ready to accept it? If this challenged what you thought you knew, don't stop here. Keep questioning, keep researching, and keep these conversations going. History is full of stories that have been buried, rewritten, or forgotten, but together, we can bring them back into the light. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments. What other historical topics should we explore? Let's keep learning from the past so we can better understand the present. And of course, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on our thought-provoking discussions. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.